Yo, so this is a conversation that's more in regards to what we've been told up until this point about the servants that were first summoned when Chaldea was created. From Mouse, he says, can Goetia be considered the first servant? Or is he simply the basis for the summoning system for servants? I'd consider him being a beast as qualifications of being a servant, so naturally I feel that make him the first. It's his nature to be the apex of servants, along with Nega Summon under his belt as the supreme summoning spell. By the way, if you haven't already, make sure you guys sign up for the Patreon. You get access to early content and priority on your request. So as you guys already know, the information that was presented to us beforehand was that Solomon, of course, was the servant that was first summoned because he's the one that participated in the war and fought alongside Marsberry, later to be reincarnated. Then you have the second servant, Galahad, being brought in to serve as a part of Chaldea's experiment to create a demi-servant with Mash. And then you have the third being Da Vinci, who, as we know, handles the logistics. That's what they tell us. So what Mouse is saying here is that he completely understands the information presented and he wants to delve a little bit further than that, going past the narrative, looking at the actual placement of Goetia in the timeline. If Goetia technically existed before Solomon, whether that be a beast or not, he would in fact be the first servant before Solomon by law. And it's very interesting that he brings this up because, for one, I've never heard anybody point this out. We always talk about the placement of the Grail War itself in terms of Grand Order doing its own thing with its own separate timeline, but I myself never even think of Goetia in that light to be somebody that precedes Solomon, especially when it outright tells us that Goetia was born from Solomon's corpse. But given his placement in the timeline for the actual series itself, this could very well be the case. I said canonically it is Solomon that comes first, but if you meant this in a roundabout way, technically it could be Goetia. And I told him that the first time that we actually see Goetia in person is in London in Solomon's body. But for him to even be present and for him to already have the plan underway beforehand, he would have had to have already existed whether we saw him or not. And then there's the whole thing about, well, Goetia's not actually a servant, he's a beast, and that's the whole point. Going past the narrative, what is a beast? The very nature of you being a beast kind of implies the idea that you could be a servant anyway. And the more I thought about it, it really, in an indirect way, it sounds a lot like the Emiya time loop and how he was summoned but the gem was already present, because it tells us outright that Goetia was already sowing the seeds before the present. It's written flat out. But what it doesn't tell us is when exactly that becomes a canonical fact. Is it immediately after Solomon died, or is it Solomon obtaining the Grail in real time that made that variable of Goetia planning his destruction to be true in the future? And I couldn't help but think of Emiya from this, and I told him I know exactly what you mean. It's one of those situations where, just like the Ryogi incident that I brought up in the Tsukihime Fate crossover and how she was able to walk into the Fate worlds, but you can't really confirm or deny at what point she became a servant because they never tell us, and we can only go off what they do, and sometimes you can't even go off that. So this is the exact same situation where it's like you can't confirm or deny whether Solomon was first or Goetia was first, really, but there are arguments that could be said to back up either one. And more than just being this mental gymnastic type of concept, it kind of sheds a lot of light to the nature of the way that Goetia works. Conceptually, Goetia is born from the myth of the 72 demons, Solomon receiving his ring and him doing his summoning. Goetia itself is a product of ancient black magic when you really break it down. And when you look at his skill, Nega Summon, that only belongs to him, nobody else has it. He's EX rank and it completely negates all these attacks from other servants when he decides to go full force. The complete cancellation, the invalidation, invincibility, absorption, reduction of symbols of heroic spirits, the noble phantasm, save for one exception. And that exception, of course, is the origin of Goetia himself, that being Solomon and his phantasm. So the foundation for Goetia as a character is built upon the same concept that was used for Emiya, coupled with the idea of this ancient black magic, which would further give him authority over all the servants in existence. Now you can say that his authority over the servants is something that was given directly from Type Moon itself. Even if you were to consider the power of Goetia, even if you were to consider the power, the authority, the blessings from God himself of Solomon, there's still people that predate Solomon in the timeline. So this is something that Type Moon has went out to say that Goetia in fact must have inherited that same authority from God that Solomon has directly as a skill itself, because there's pretty much no other way that Goetia could have this, at least background wise. So the same way that Solomon was able to peer through time, the same way that he has his clairvoyance, we know that Goetia was doing the same thing, but as a method to bring a better light to the future, so to speak. And he's doing it from a completely, I guess you could say, AI perspective. No feelings involved, nothing beyond calculation and what should be correct based on the values of humanity itself. The thing about Nega Summon is very similar to the clairvoyance. If Goetia is also quote unquote all-knowing, this would also give him access to that same divine blessing of knowing exactly who everybody is, knowing their weaknesses, knowing their backgrounds without even actually interacting with them. He doesn't have to know them personally or up front. The very data that his foundation is built upon is going to know it anyway, whether he knows it personally or not. And I'm just trying to give a little more elaboration as to why he has all these different things in one skill. This is just one skill out of his entire palette, and it pretty much goes to say, because of his authority of knowing everything about you, you can do nothing to him actually if he wills it. Now in the story itself, we have seen prior to Solomon's intervention that a lot of people were doing attacks on him, punches, blasts, throwing him around, all these different things, but they weren't actually doing anything. It just looked away. And it's very interesting to think just how powerful this being is, and he hardly really even gets the credit for it because he's a part 1 antagonist, but he still stands over majority of the people that we went against even now. Not to say that he's the end all be all, it's just that it's kind of hard to outright these parameters unless you take it outside the world itself, which we've kind of already done considering the intervention of the alien god. Now I have heard people talk about how ridiculously OP Goetia is at his base. I have heard that before a lot. It's just something that, again, doesn't hardly get focused on because, well, it seems like they themselves have forgot about the character, even though from a narrative perspective, he's supposed to have been reborn. And that's another question that brings me to, with all this hinting and implications of a redemption arc for his character, not knowing the actual circumstances of what we felt because those values weren't really instilled in him as this pseudo AI. They've hinted at the idea of him being reborn in Roman's old body and him helping us out at these different points within the story. But what will this really mean for him exactly? When do they plan to bring this full circle? And by the time that they do finally bring it full circle, will people even still care? I mean, personally, whenever they decide to do it, if they do and don't leave it as some type of lore bite as usual, at this point, I don't even know how you could do that because it is pretty integral to the overall story of FGO. But if they decide to do this, what story will the reborn Goetia have to tell that hasn't been said already with all the things that we've dealt with after him and the things that we've dealt with including him? Is he one of the people that's going to help us face against Ritsuka? Because the way that I'm looking at it, that would also be poetry at work, right? This person that we help find humanity to go against the person that has lost their humanity because they went out of their way to save it. I mean, if they decided to go that route, I could see that aligning perfectly if that's what they were going for. I'm just trying to see, how do you explain his absence? What will his new form entail? Because I feel like more than him just being this shadow of Roman, this shadow of Solomon, at this point in time, or the time that he starts to come back around, he definitely deserves his own identity. And so I really want to know, what does that look like? Will it be a combination of the two? I'm highly doubting that he'll revert to his Age of Man version that we fought against afterwards, that could be the case. It just seems like it would be unnecessary to recycle that moment that's supposed to be a unique and brilliant moment in time specific to that decay of his former self. So to bring that back again would almost be like he still harbors some of those feelings, when from a narrative perspective he's supposed to have been moved past that point and he's supposed to be growing as an individual and not stepping back. We've seen quite a few characters bite the dust. We've seen some characters feel as if they should have a bigger presence and then they only show up for a selected amount of time, which for many people seems like robbery, because it's like you're supposed to be that character and we only get you for 5 minutes. One of the first people that come to mind is Noah. Technically, we still haven't gotten the real Noah. And then even when we did get Noah, it was a pseudo FGO version of Noah taking on the vessel of Nemo. Would still love to get the real version of him sometime, if that's possible. I know there's a lot going on currently, and they kind of shimmy back and forth quite a bit on whether or not they want to go with a certain spirit to fill in these roles. But as far as arcade goes, at least for us on the other side, it's kind of hard to identify with the whole story if you're not actually in Japan playing it. So even ideas like him existing feel real distant, even though we know for a fact that they happen. And even though we have the FGO arcade collab, it kind of just retells the same story and flips things around in different places. It still feels just as distant. Now, in regards to Goetia now, Egg brought up the fact that this does sound pretty on point. He says, well, considering that the heroic spirit summoning system is based off grand heroic spirits being summoned to fight and kill beasts, and that a beast must emerge first for a grand to even appear, I'd say that Goetia being the first summoned being would be on track. Probably can have Zelrech peer into other timelines to get that download. He also agrees with this sentiment. And honestly, I wouldn't mind seeing some sort of Zelrech interlude where we can get some time off with him and he can actually be more of a character and not just a figment of imagination. And we can see him doing his job a lot like what we see in Strange Fate, where he's kind of overseeing the events that's happening there. Even going back to the idea of Goetia being this supreme summoning system, and how he was able to at will unsummon service around him just because he wanted that to happen, because he has that authority over them. And the only way to really circumvent this is if you are in fact an experiment of some sort, like MASH, a demi-servant where a spirit has been placed inside of you rather than brought forth by the fate summoning system itself. And really, when you think about it that way, in the event that we didn't have Solomon's help on our side, and this doesn't just go for Goetia but anybody of his nature, anybody that has the same foundation, the only people that we could have really used against him were humans who had an even greater authority, which where the fuck are we gonna find that at that point in the story, or a team of Type Moon X-Men. And even if we use MASH for an example, that experiment didn't go nearly as good as Mars Berry thought that it would have, for a lot of different reasons. And I would argue that one of the only reasons that it did go so well is because of who MASH was and because of the spirit that was selected. You know, he really lucked out grabbing Galahad and not just anybody who may have very well rejected the calling or rejected the body and felt no means to fulfill a purpose in the first place. So even if we were to come together with this so-called Type Moon X-Men, they would still have to abide and fit the storyline. And not everybody is going to do that. I mean, this dude is a straight up monster. He's got the same EX clairvoyance as Solomon, eyesight of good quality, apprehension of long distance target, and elevation of kinetic vision. When the rank is high enough, even X-ray vision or future prediction becomes possible. Solomon's clairvoyance of both the past and the future. Due to clairvoyance being a skill embedded to the body, it can be used by Goetia, because it's also been mentioned beforehand that certain skills like revelation wasn't available to him because of his identity being the spirits that nested in Solomon's corpse. Romani claims that due to the potency of said skill, it can essentially be considered omniscience. However, without the guidance of revelation, it ultimately drove Goetia to begin the human order of incineration. And that's the ironic part about it, right? You have all this omnipotence, EX clairvoyance, you can look into the future, but you couldn't look into your own end. And it's not because he didn't want to. Him having that skill basically would have ruined the entire story. So you can't give him that skill, because then he gets to see the vision where, oh, that's not gonna go so well. Oh, they fucked me up. Like, imagine him looking into the future and seeing him getting bopped. You know what? I'm just gonna leave things the way they are. So there goes the first half of Grand Order. And you know something funny? I actually wouldn't mind seeing how that went down. Okay, let's say that Goetia didn't happen. Then what? Because he served as the basis for a lot of things. Goetia not happening means that, like I mentioned, the first part of the story doesn't happen. 1.5 doesn't happen because that only happened because of Goetia. And honestly, you can say that part 2 still happens, but a lot of that is driven through the trial and error of what he did beforehand. So even then, we come up with a completely different story. I mean, he even had authority over all the timelines. It showed us that real time in the movie itself when he showed all the different planets. So narrative wise, that wouldn't be possible, but if they were to make that to be the case, it would be an interesting direction. But yeah, I gotta agree, no Goetia content is a shame. Still waiting on that man to come back, still waiting on that involvement in possibly a servant form, because it has been well over long enough and the day ones really deserve it.